I want to go back to this question of how the how the Klei Hamikdash were set out in the Beit Hamikdash. And we're going to. So last week we looked at some of the sources in Divrei Hayamim, and among the things that we learned are that Shlomo, in addition to Kior and the menorah and the shulchan that were in the Mishkan, that he made 10 of each of those. One of the questions we had was that 10 including the ones from Moshe, or was it plus? In other words, it would be 11 of everything. And I realized later that there's a proof from the text that would indicate 10 in addition to the ones from the Mishkan. Oh, and of all the things I prepared, 1 second. Let's just bring that up. I'll show you what I mean. The other thing. Okay. Aside from my slightly sore throat, my internet seems to be sore than usual. And if I drop out for any length of time, you should tell me. Okay. So one of the psukim here says Divrei Yamim K. There's a parallel pasuk in Melachim, but here it says, "Vatishlam kol hamlacha asher asa Shlomo leveit Hashem." Wait, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I'm sharing that screen. No, I'm not. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Vatishlam kol hamlacha asher asa Shlomo leveit Hashem. So they finished all the work. That Shlomo finished all the work for the Beit HaMikdash. And here it says, Vayavesh Shlomo et Kodshei David Aviv, et HaKesef et HaZahav ve'et kol HaKelim Natan Botzrot Beit HaElokim. He brought all of the holy things from his father David, the silver, the gold, and all of the kelim, all of the vessels had Natan, he placed in Otzrot Beit HaElokim. Now, just a sec. This sounds like it implies that so read the Pshuto Shel Mikra. Here it says that he took all of those things and he put them in the treasure house, or the storage area of the Beit HaMikdash. But you might understand from a little bit later, as it says here in Pasuk, Vayalu et Aaron v'et Ohel Moed v'et kol klei hakodesh asher ba'ohel ha'alu otam hakohanim haleviim. So specifically the Aron, the Ohel, which in this context could be referring to the coverings of the Ohel, the things that make it an Ohel, like all of the Yeriot that covered the Mishkan, and all of the Klei HaKodesh that were the Ohel. So the Klei HaKodesh that were in the Ohel, that were in the Mishkan, that would have been, besides the Aron, it would be also, of course, the Mishkan, Zahav, and the Shulchan. Those were brought up by the Kohanim, the Leviim. And so, if that's true, and then this, a little bit further, we learned that we talked about the Aron specifically. So this seems to imply that the menorah, the mizbeach, and the shulchan of Moshe were brought into the Beit HaMikdash. And then what we learned about all of the extra, the 10 menorot, the 10 shulchanot, and presumably also the 10 kiorim. We're not going to talk about the kiorim because they were outside the Azara, but have been in addition to the ones that Moshe had made. That seems to be implicit in the psukim here in Divrei Hayamim. So I'll remind you that we looked at the Mishnah in Menachot, and I showed you that there's one line in the Mishnah there. There's a discussion there about specifically about the Shulchan and how the Lechem HaPanim was put onto the Shulchan. And actually, I spent a lot of time preparing the sugya for that when I realized I wanted to do that anyway, but I don't think we're going to do it here in this class. There's an extensive discussion in the Gemara about exactly how the lechem was placed on the shulchan. And also there's an extensive discussion, the exact measurements regarding the mizbeach specifically. And these are all, to me, they're all fascinating things. But I'm trying to keep a focus here because I do eventually want to get back to Yoma. But because this did come, you were learning already Masechet Tamid about the placement. There we had this question about the placement of the menorah. So I wanted that in this context of this sugya here in Menachot that discusses the placement of the kelim in the Beit HaMikdash generally. So, sorry, hold on a second. So the placement of these things in the Beit, and of course here we're mainly going to focus on the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo, but it will have ramifications for how we understood the Beit HaMikdash of Beit Sheni. So the Mishnah. So here this is skipping the sugya. I think goes back to Daf Tzadi Hey. And here we're skipping ahead to Daf Tzadi Chet. And the Gemara here quotes the Mishnah that says, Kol HaKelim Shebemikdash. So what was the full Mishnah there? The Mishnah there says, at this discussion about the Shulchan, it says, Kol HaKelim Shayu B'Mikdash Orkan Orkol Shel Bait. all of the vessels that were in the Mikdash, their length went the length of the house. So again, just to remind us, so the length of the house, meaning that if they're going along that, right, so each of these kelim that we're going to be focused on will be three kelim, the Aron, the Menorah, and the Shulchan, because all of those have a different length and width. The Mizbeach HaZahav, its length and width are the same. So it's not irrelevant. It's not relevant to this discussion, because however you turn it, it's still going to be lengthwise and widthwise the same, the same way. But the Shulchan, the Menorah, the Aron all had a longer side and a shorter side, a length and a width. So if we say that something is going along the length of the house, we mean that it's going east to west. And if it's going on the width, it's going against the width of the house, then it would be going from north to south. So here it says, Stam kol hakelim sheyu b'mikdash, or kan le'orcho shel bayit. All of the kelim that were in the mikdash, their length went the length of the house. So as we'll see, of course, that was not true about the Aron. The Gemara is going to say that the Aron is different. And we're going to also find out that there's this machloket running the menorah. So it really just leaves the Shulchan, that L'kulei Alma, everybody holds that the Shulchan went from east to west. So let's look at the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Kol Kelim Shebimikdash, etc. In other words, all the Kelim, the Mikdash went the length of the house. So Gemara brings Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. We learn in a Braita, Kol HaKelim Shebimikdash, or Kan Chol Shel Bayit, Chutz Meron, Shakol Rachbo Shel Bayit. So the Braita here makes that exception. All of the Kelim in the Mikdash, their length went the length of the house, except for the Aron, whose length went the width of the house. And the Gemara is going to bring proof for that assertion. And that's how it was placed. And that's how its staves were placed. So this last part here is not clear, right? What do you think this means? It says all of the kelim in the Mikdash, their length went the length of the house, except for the Aron that went along the width of the house. And then it says, and that's how it was placed. And that's how its badim were placed. So of course we have the question, what does that mean? Like, what is that? Kachaya munach doesn't seem to add anything, because it just says that the Aron went the length of the house. So what does the add to say kachaya munach? And then also, what does it mean to say that the badim were also that were also placed that way? What does that mean at all? So that's not clear. It's not clear exactly what that means. So the Gemara right away asks, "My ka'amar, what is it saying? Like, how do we understand this?" Hachi ka'amar. So this is how we'll understand it. This is how we'll read it. Kachayamunach, that's how it was placed. Mi dibadav kachayumunachim, because that's how the badim were placed. So, in other words, it's like an emendation to the nusach of the Braita, where they're saying kachayamunach, which refers to the Aron. And the kachaya badam, what we understand that really means is mi dibadav kachayum munachim. It's as if they're adding an extra word. The Aron was placed from north to south. In other words, its length was placed along parallel to the width of the bud. because its badim were placed that way. Okay, so it's still a little bit obscure, but we learned about this when we were learning back in Melachim and in Divrei Hayamim, and now we'll see it here in the Gemara. What does it mean that Kachayam, that the badim were placed that way? Ubadav minalan. Where do we know about the staves, how they were placed? So we know here from the Braita, the Tanya, we learn in a Braita, Vayarichu habadim. They lengthened the staves. Yachu lo hayu nogin beparocht. Talmud lomar v'yareu. V'yareu, yachu yehu mekarin beparochet v'yotzin. So the pasuk says that they lengthened the badim, and then you might say, okay, they lengthened the badim, but maybe they didn't actually touch the parochet, but the pasuk says vayareu, that they were seen. So if vayareu, if they were seen, Yahu Yehu Mekarin beparochet v'yotzin. They could have ripped through or broken the parochet and go out so that you could actually see them. Talmud Lamar, but the pasuk says Lo yera'u hachutza. They were not seen on the outside. Haketzad. So how does that work? Dochkin boltin beparochet. They were pushing at and poking out the parochet, and they were like the two nipples of a woman. As it says, Tzror Hamor Dodili Shadayali. Okay, so right. Right, so just to remind us, this was the pasuk, and this is the pasuk as it's brought down in Melachim, and it's done pretty much the same way in Divrei Hayamim. Vayarichu habadim, vayareu roshei badim min hakodesh al pnei hadvir. They lengthened the badim, and the heads of the staves were seen from the Kodesh. In other words, if you were standing in the Kodesh in the Heichal, then you would see the heads of the Kodesh al pnei hadvir, on the front of the dvir, meaning on the front of the separation between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. V'lo yera'u achutza, but they were not seen outward. Vayushman hayom hazeh, and they were there until this day. Okay, so before we look at Rashi, what is this? So what was our question and what was the answer? What was the Gemara's question?
What is the orientation of the Aron?
So we started off with this assumption that the Aron is oriented from north to south. And then we had this Braita, because the Braita says that, right? So the Mishnah doesn't mention the Aron. It just says all of the Kelim went the length of the Bayit. But then I have this Braita which brings the exception. The exception is the Aron. The Aron goes the width of the house. The Braita says in this kind of obscure language that that's the way it was placed, and that's the way its adim were placed. That's the way its staves were placed. So the Gemara says, like, what does that mean? That's the way its staves. So it says that the Aron, that's how the Aron was placed from east to west, because the badim were placed thus. And what does it mean that they were placed thus? So now from the Braita, so, right, we know from the Braita that the staves were placed going in what direction?
East-west.
From east to west. So that was our question of Badnalan. How do I know that the staves were placed that way, meaning that they were going from east to west? So at this point in the Gemara, I just want to point out, the Gemara is the Gemara is telling us that the Aron went from north to south. It's also assuming that the staves on the tabaot that hold the staves and the staves themselves are going to be on the width, right? So that means the approximate length between one bud to the other bud is going to be 2.5. All right, if it was the other, then meaning if the staves went along the length of the Aron, then the distance between them would be 1.5 amot, because the Aron is 2.5 amot by 1 amot. So just pointing that out because we'll come back to it later.
So the rings were attached to the short edges.
Yes. Yeah, and the Gemara is going. We mentioned this before, and I think we also saw it in Rashi or the Radak. See in the Gemara is going to say this here. This is the sugya where they learn it from. And again, I'll point out, reading the sources in Malachim and in Divrei Hayamim, these questions they're not obvious. It's not immediately how these things are being placed, right? So the Gemara here is going through with this careful reading to give us these details. So again, very good. So the question was ubadav minalan. Where do I know? What's the source that tells me that the badim were placed in such a way that they went from east to west? So then I have this Braita that tells us, because learn it out, because it says vayarichu habadim, and that the badim got all the way up to the parochet in such a way that they were poking at the parochet. They didn't actually go through the parochet, but if you were in the heichal, you would see the impressions in the parochet made by the heads of the badim. And they bring a nice drasha. They say, right, it's like min shnei dadaisha, like it says tzur hamor dodili ben shadayali, which homiletically seems to mean that the Aron, as it were, is between the two. It's like as if it's between the two breasts of a woman. In this very intimate place. Let's take a look before we go on. No, actually, let's go on here a little bit before we go on, before we look at Rashi. So now, all of this is assuming, right? We're still left a question though. See, it says ubadav minalan. Where do I know the badim from? And what's the answer? So it tells us that the bad poking through the parochet. Minalan, the Gemara says, "Dibadav lefutia da'aron havu yatfen." Still doesn't prove to me that the badim were on the width side. Putia is the width. How do I know that they were placed on the width side? Because it could have also been that they were on the long side, and I could still be Mekayem, these psukim that tell me that you could see the heads of the badim poking at the parochet. How do I know? How do I know that they were actually which side? Dilma the arkod the aron havu. Maybe they were actually placed on the side of the aron. Amar Rav Yehuda. Gavre ba'amta ufalga lo mistagni. Two men in 1.5 amot, it would not be enough for them. So, what's he saying? What's his implication? That two men can't, would not. It would not be 1.5 amot is not enough space for two men.
It is assuming that the people carrying the shulchan, actually, first of all, then there's one on one bod and one on the other bod. Second of all, that they're actually on the inside of the badim as opposed to outside of the badim.
Okay, so let's go back. So first of all, we're talking, yes, about the aron, not the shulchan, but
I meant Sarah.
Yeah, that's okay. We won't take off points. So it's assuming that you have two men side by side carrying the aron, which implies what? How many men then would be carrying the aron together?
4.
4.
A minimum of 4. A minimum of 4.
Right. So we're always going to go after a minimum unless we know otherwise. That's a general rule, because we say tafasta meruba lo tafasta. If you don't know more than X, then you go with X. So here, Rabbi Yehuda says, two men in 1.5 amot, it would not be enough for them. So what is that in? What question is he? What was the question he was answering?
So the question he's answering is whether they were on the whether they were on the width side, whether they're widthwise or lengthwise.
So he says, if we put them on the length, then there's only 1.5 amot between the two of them. And we have to have two men, presumably on side of the aron, carrying the aron. 1.5 amot would not be enough space for them to be next to each other and the aron. Okay?
They would touch one another and they would stumble on one another.
Right. It seems like it would be a very awkward position. And I think, Michael Werner, I think you implied something. What I think you said also, that it implies that they were where they would have been standing. That is, if I have the two badim, I might have conceived that maybe I have one on the outside of this bud and one on the outside of this bud. But exactly how are they carrying it? Are they bringing it up on their shoulders? Are they carrying it down next to them? But even if you were to say that they're carrying, that they're not right next to each other, I think I would still go with what Paul said, that they would still be close. And as you're walking, they might bump into each other. So that seems to, so this is Rabbi Yehuda's argument. Rabbi Yehuda's argument is he's not saying there's an full written source that tells me which side of the aron the badim were placed, right? And if we go back and look in Parshat Truma, and we look in Parshat Pekudei, and we look in Malach, look in Divrei Hayamim, in all of those places where it talks about the aron, it doesn't actually tell us this outright. But we do know the dimensions, because the Torah tells us the dimensions of the aron. So based on the idea that there are dimensions to the Aron, 2.5 by 1.5, based on the idea that the Torah tells us that there are two staves, and the two staves are going to be used for carrying the Aron, then logic indicates that I'm going to put the staves on the width side and not on the length side. That's Rabbi Yehuda's argument. But of course, he's also assuming, like you said a moment ago, that means that you have 4 people carrying it. Because I could have said, I have 2 people carrying it, in which case it might be better if it's on the length. There's only 1.5 amot between the staves, because then the person can grab each side, or he put it on his katef. It would be possible. So the Gemara says, so where do we know that it was carried by 4? How do I know that 4 people carried it? Because it doesn't say that explicitly either. So they bring a Raya from Bamidbar about the Avodat HaLeviim. Says Dichtiv, and there it's also the Avodat HaKohanim. Dichtiv HaKahatim, tray, Nosei HaMikdash, nami tray. So what's that about? So in Bamidbar, we saw this not long ago in Parshat HaShavua. Second. Oof. Remember, the psukim here are all about we have psukim at the end of Naso, at the beginning of Bahalot, specific that were given to the different mishpachot HaLeviim, and then also some of the jobs that were given to the Kohanim whenever the Mishkan had to be packed up and moved. And here we're skipping ahead. Vayhi b'shana hashenit b'chodesh hasheni b'yasrim l'chodesh nala ha'anan me'mishkan ha'idut. So now we're in the second year. It's the second month. It's on the 20th of Iyar. In other words, it's a week. It's now, well, not exactly a week, but a few days after Pesach Sheni. Then the Anan goes up from the Mishkan, which is a sign that they have to start moving out. So Vayisu b'nei Yisrael masehem mimidbar Sinai, Vayishkon ha'anan b'midbar Paran, Vayisu v'rishona al pi Hashem yad Moshe. So they start to travel, they start to move. So the first to go out is Machane b'nei Yehuda b'rishona l'tzivotam v'al tzva'o Nachshon ben Aminadab. So he's the Nasi and he's leading B'nai Yehuda. V'al tzva b'nei Matei Tzachar Netanel ben Tzura v'tzva Matei b'nei Zvulun Eliab ben Chilel. Those were the 3 eastern tribes. And then it says, Rada Mishkan, the Mishkan was taken down, V'nasu b'nei Gershon v'nei Merari nosei HaMishkan. So b'nei Gershon, b'nei Merari are the ones who are carrying the Mishkan. In other words, they're going to be carrying the parts of the Mishkan. Then Reuven is the leader of the southern tribes, right? There's 3 in each direction. So the first 3 moved out. Then they dismantled the Mishkan, and then the southern tribes are going to start to move out. Shimon Shemiah ben Surishadai, Mate ben Ekada, Yosef ben Duel. Then it says, "V'nasu hakahatim nosei hamikdash, v'hekimu et mishkan ad boam." So the kahat, who are they're the ones who are carrying the. I'm sorry, they're the Leviim. V'hekimu et mishkan boam, and they put up the mishkan until they come. Right, so they're out in front with the Mishkan. So plain pshat, nasu hakaratim nosei hamikdash. It's actually not clear exactly what the plain pshat is, because we already talked about B'nai Gershon of B'nai Merari nosei hamishkan. They're carrying the Mishkan. So what was the Mishkan? So plain is, the simple thing to say is that this is the Mishkan. Let's look at Rashi for a second. Hurada Mishkan, kevan shenosei ad machane Yehuda. As soon as the flag of the camp of Yehuda went out, nichnasu Aharon uvanav. Right, so they went in, they took down the parochet, and they covered up the aron. So that's at the end of Naso. And what does it say? It's the rest of the pasuk. They'll at parochet hamasach. They remove the parochet and they cover. That's the first thing they do. They remove the parochet and they use that to cover over the whole aron. Shown of B'nai Merari for Kishkan Tonim Utan Ba'agalot. So B'nai Gershon, B'nai Merari, once the aron is covered, right? So it gets covered with. I should just point out, it's not the covering of the aron. Just to remind you, the first covering was the parochet, and then Benatnualav Kisui or Tachash, covered over with the skin of a tachash. Ufarsu beged klil tchelet l'mala l'mala b'spadav, and then lastly they would cover it with a cloth of tchelet. So you didn't actually see the parochet either. There were 3 coverings to the aron. B'nai Gershon, B'nai Merari, they would take down the Mishkan, the Tonina Tabagalot. They would carry the shim and so forth in wagons. V'aron u'klei hakodesh shel masa b'nei kahat. It was the job of b'nei kahat to carry the aron, right? So that's also, it says v'fila aron of another chasod v'takodesh v'kol klei hakodesh v'ntzom machaneh v'achrei chen yavo b'nei kahat l'seit. Then once Aaron and his sons, in other words, once the Kohanim cover up the aron, then B'nai Kahat come in to carry it. Although Yigu al Hakod Meitu, they won't touch the kosh and thereby die. Elamasa B'nai Kahat Bo'om away. Right, this was the work of B'nai Kahat in the O'am away. So they were tasked with moving the aron. So here, back where the task is mentioned first, it doesn't say how many B'nai Kahat you need to the aron. So they would kind of omdim v'chusin v'nutunim al hamatot ad shenasa degel Reuven v'achar kach v'nasu hakatim. Right. So like we said, they would come in, they would get ready, and they would wait then for Reuven to pull out on the south, and then they would move out with Dash, with the Aron. So in Pasuk Kaf Aleph, it says Nasu Hakatim Nosei HaMikdash. So Rashi says Pshat, HaMikdash Nosei HaDvarim HaMikudashim. They were the carriers of the whole things that were sanctified. So that's the simple way of understanding it. The Gemara here, though, wants to darshan it. And what's the drasha? So the drasha is, so we want to know, how do we know that there were 4 people carrying it? So the pasuk doesn't say b'mforash. So they say, we learn it from here, because it says team tray. When it says that the kahat carried it, or traveled, or it's traveling, moving the aron, kahatim, again, minimum 2, it's a plural, so it means that there's 2 kahatim. But then it says nosei hamikdash, namitre. It's also 2. In other words, the way the drasha works, the drasha is saying, I see these as two parts. There's the kahatim and nosei hamikdash, which might seem a little bit remote in terms of the pshat, right? Because Nosei HaMikdash, Shuto Shel Mikra, is that Nosei HaMikdash is describing the Kahatim. The Kahatim were the ones who carried Dash. And in the context, we understand that Dash is the Aron. The way the Gemara wants to tell me is that it's actually two sets of people. There's Kahatim and there's Nosei HaMikdash. And the argument in favor of that reading is that Nosei HaMikdash is superfluous. I already know what the job of the Kahatim is. I already know that they're going to be carrying the Aron, so I don't really need the Torah to say the words Nosei HaMikdash. On the other hand, it could just be that it's an asmachta. It's not 100% clear to me if this is an absolute drasha or not. Oh, hold on one minute. Michael Schwartz, by the way, messaged me, I see now, about 15 minutes ago. He dropped out. He said they're having an electrical problem in the apartment, so he may not be back. Okay, so that's the source for understanding how I know that you need 4 people to carry it. So,
yeah,
yes.
I guess the Aron with the stone tablets and the kaporet should have been quite heavy. So maybe it would have been too heavy for 2 people, even for 4 people. But if they are jabarim, maybe they can do it.
So I think this is important to point out. Actually, it's also the here later on. I know we certainly won't get it to tonight. We will get to it eventually, but toward a little bit or somewhat further on in the sugya is a source where we learned that the luchot and the shivrei luchot were both placed in the aron. So we don't actually know how heavy the stones were, but we know that they were supposed to fit, the length and the width were supposed to fit sort of precisely into the aron. So it's reasonable to say that they were probably pretty heavy, and you have 2 sets of them. Plus, what Paul is pointing out, even if you say the aron, the basic is wood, but it's covered inside and outside with gold. And then I have on the kaporet, I have the kruvim, which are entirely gold. So by this point, the whole thing, this whole enterprise is now very heavy. It's significantly heavy. So it also just stands to reason, what Paul is saying, it just stands to reason that you would need at least 4 people to carry it. Now, I'll interject here something that's not in the Gemara here, but it's brought down elsewhere. there's a medrash that says that the Aaron actually carried the Kohanim and not the way around. It looked like the Kohanim were carrying the Aaron, but really the Aaron carried the Kohanim. It was by way of, and maybe we'll come back to that, not tonight, but it's a very interesting concept. For the moment, we're just going with the plain pshat, which is we have people need to carry the Aaron. That's the Pshuto Shel Mikra in Bamidbar. People who are tasked with carrying the Aaron, just like there are people tasked with carrying every other aspect of the Mishkan.
We might we also might note, I think as we've done before, that the paroch and the kaporet, and specifically the keruvim above the kaporet, if in fact they are made out of zahav tahor, were physically impossible. And so therefore we can assume that there is a kind of buoyancy of some kind.
Oh, that's very interesting. Oh, I had never thought of that. Wow. Yafeh. In other words, if I understand what you're saying, right? So we've pointed this out before, right? If anything that's made from absolutely pure gold is not a structure that can stand, it's going to settle, right? There's not enough structural integrity in the middle itself to hold it.
It's a very soft metal, and that's part of why you can get gold leaf and things like that.
Right, it's a very soft metal, and if it's not mixed with something else, want to make it, like if you want to make it stand, you would have to be mixed with something else. But now you're suggesting that this is very interesting. If we're already saying that there are certain miracles that are associated with the Aaron specifically, there's a Gemara says that there are a bunch of miracles associated with the Aaron. Gila, I think 10 miracles associated with the Aaron. Maybe this is one of the aspects, and it's actually similar conceptually to this idea that the Aaron itself lifted, and carried the Aaron, carried the Kohanim. The source for that, by the way, is the story in Yehoshua when Bnei Yisrael have to cross over the Yarden. So as I'm sure you remember, the Kohanim go in, the Yarden goes straight up in the air. Everybody goes by, and then it says the Kohanim go out, and then the Yarden goes back to where it was. So you could Pshuto Shel Mikra is that they got up out of the Yarden, meaning that they got up on the western side. But you could also read it that they got up on the eastern side, which is Chazal want to understand. You can make the argument there if you look at the psukim that they had stepped in and then they stepped out. Then it says that Vayavor et Yarden. It specifically uses a singular verb when it's describing the Kohanim going, passing over the Yarden, and the drasha is that it was really the Aaron that passed over the Yarden, and it brought the Kohanim with it. You can look there; it's in Perek Gimel in Yeshua. The Radak actually rejects the drasha on the grounds that there isn't any real need for it in the pshat, but it fits into certain other conceptual aspects of this whole configuration. So now, Mike, you're adding in something else, which I think really does fit in. Yes. Oh, go ahead.
You should also consider this accident with Uzzah, who stumbled, and then the poor guy was struck down. And I don't remember the wording, but maybe you could understand something from the wording.
I think that yes, it's also relevant, right? Because he gets struck down for trying to hold up the Aaron, and the indication is that was a kind of, I don't want to say the word blasphemy, but that was something that was seen as being as wrong, because the Aaron can take care of itself, right? And so what would it mean? So that you're right, it fits into the same idea that the Aron, ostensibly it looks like it's being carried, but really it carries the people that carry it. So then why do you need people carrying it at all? So it's a separate question, but I would say the idea is that it's still a kavod for the Aron, that it should be, as it were, carried by people. But then, because of the nature of the Aron, it's actually carrying them. What this fits into, since we've managed to digress on this for as long as we have, fits into an idea that we see in Yechezkel's vision of the Kisei HaKavod, that the Kisei HaKavod looks as if it's being held up by the Chayot, but we understand it's really the Kisei HaKavod that's holding up the Chayot. And the Aron, which is Makom Hadom Raglav, right, Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, is keneged the Kisei. And so it has a similar action, is a similar pu'ula as the, and that's why this idea seems to be an important. It has a reflection in Shemayim that's not here.
It also fits the midrash that it only looked as if Moshe was assembling the Mishkan. Actually, the Mishkan
assembled itself, right? Yeah, so these are all very interesting ideas. For our purposes here, let's come back. So now, we said in the beginning of this part of this Gemara here to point out the things, that the Aron was placed in the Mikdash from north to south, so that its length was along the width of the Beit HaMikdash, in contradistinction to the Shulchan and the Menorah. At this point, we're going with the idea that both the Shulchan and the Menorah went from east, and we'll eventually come back to that. So we figured out, so this whole idea of the Aron going lengthwise from north to south, we figure it out in this kind of roundabout way, or this step-by-step way might be a better way of putting it. So we start off with the idea that we understand that from Pshat in Melachim and in Divrei Hayamim, that the Badim were sticking out, they were making impression harochet, and that's one thing. But then I still need to know that, so that doesn't necessarily tell that the Badim were on the side. They might have been on the length side, and maybe that in fact the Aron was oriented from east to west like the other Kelim. So then I say no, it would have been that way. And how do I know? Because I know that the Badim must have been on the width side to make enough room for 4 people to carry it. So now that's my set of proofs. So one of that, now I know this is the orientation of Aron. Let's look at Rashi here. So Rashi says, Kol Kelim Shebemikdash, right? Or Kanlo Kosher Bayit is the whole quote from the Mishnah. Rashi here says Kol Kelim Kagom Shulchanot or Kanlo or Kan Shel Bayit Mimizrach Lemarav, meaning like the Shulchanot. What are the other Kelim? So like the Shulchanot. This is all in parentheses. It's a technical matter because according to the Gilei Anashas, this comment should have been a few daf earlier in the Rashi Mishnah. Kol HaKelim Shebimikdash Orkan L'Orcho Shel Bayit, that's the Braita. Chutz She'orko L'Rachbo Shel Bayit, except for the Aron, that its length was the length of the house. The
Shel.
Yes.
What about the Mizbeach HaZahav?
So I mentioned
where was it?
That Zahav is square. It's square, so it doesn't matter what way I turn it. It's going to be lengthened. It has no special distinction. By the way,
but it's along the eastern wall of the Kodesh. Yes, is it facing the Parochet?
It's in the Parochet. It's in the middle. It's middle of the Kodesh.
It's not against one of the walls. It's in the middle.
It's toward the middle. It's toward the middle, and as we do, we'll hopefully get a more exact placement. See, ultimately, what we need to figure out is the place Mishkan. The placement of the Mizbeach, the Shulchan, the Menorah, and the Mishkan. But then we also have to figure out the placement of those three things in Beit Shel Shlomo, where I'm going to have an additional 10 Shulchanot, an additional 10 Menorot. So where is everything going to be placed? Placed in such a way that the Kohanim
they are not
can
in
actually...
the Kodesh. I didn't understand. I thought they were in the Hechal, not in the Kodesh, but there is not enough room in the Kodesh to put all these Shulchanot.
The Kodesh and the Hechal are the same thing. It's the Kodesh of Kodesh.
I mean the entrance, not before the Kodesh.
You mean the Ulam?
Ulam.
In the Ulam. So
they are in the Ulam.
So we'll learn later. Well, okay, we learned a long time ago. There are two Shulchanot in the Ulam. There's one that's Shel Kesef and one Shel Zahav. On the right is Shel Kesef, and on the left is Shel Zahav. It's brought down in Masechet Midot. And those are the Shulchanot where, when they were bringing in the Lechem HaPanim, they would put it down on the Shulchan of Kesef, and then they would bring it in and take out the old Lechem HaPanim and the old Lechem. They would take on the way out and put it on the Shulchan. But those are not the same Shulchanot that we're talking about in Divrei Yamim when it says that Shlomo made 10 Shulchanot. There are 10 Shulchanot that are holding Lechem HaPanim. Those are in addition. That's Pshuto Shel Mikra. That's what it's talking about in Divrei Yamim. But
so there should be many tables. I don't understand where you could put where would you put all these 10 tables?
So exactly. We need to understand where exactly would they have placed. Now you may remember, this is something that maybe I've been thinking about a lot, as you see, because we spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKodesh, where he stood and all of that. The same thing. One of the other questions that we're going to have to answer, which we did look at when we were doing the Mishnayot, is how did the Kohen get through the Hechal before he got to the Kodesh HaKodeshim? What was his route going in? And there's actually a machloket about that also, but we actually didn't digress on it. But we'll come back to it.
Is there a door between the Ulam and the Kodesh, or doorway, or something like this, an opening?
Yeah, I mean the Kodesh, yes, there's explicitly a doorway. When the Ulam has two doors on the front, and then there's a space to fight, which is the width of the Ulam, and then you have the Hechal. So we learned this, and there's also machloket about the door. exactly which way the doors opened into, but let's go according to the opinion that says that the doors of the Heichal, right, the Kohen went in the morning, it's kind of through a side door, and then he would open up the doors of the Heichal from the inside, and they would fold over. They were 5 amot wide, that they would fold over in half, so that when you folded them into the ulam, covered 2.5 amot on each side of the wall of the ulam, and then they would open the doors from the outside, and they would do the same thing. They would fold in half and then fold onto the walls, so they would cover the other 2.5 amot. So then when you walked in, once both doors were open, then you didn't actually see the wall of the ulam, because it would be covered in the golden doors that it would have been open. Yes, so there are doors going in, but exactly where was the Shulchan of Moshe and the 10 Shulchanot of Shlomo and the menorah of Moshe and the Eser menorot of Shlomo? These things we need to figure out, because yes, the Beit Shel Shlomo is much larger, but it's still limited in size, and we need to place things. There's a physical aspect, right? You have to be able to place things in such a way that the Kohanim who are coming in to do avodah have access to these things. They have to be able to go in and put in this, like put the lechem, take the old lechem off. They have to be able to go in and do the hatavat neirot, right? So all of these things need to be figured. So, right. So that's getting a little bit.
If there are 10 menorot, you also have to do. Maybe it's not an avodah, but you have to do it. The hatavat neirot of the other menorot. You have to light them.
You're getting a little ahead of us here, but we'll talk about that. There's a machloket later on about whether or not all the other menorot were lit, and if all the other shulchanot actually filled with lechem apanim. There's some people say yes, and some people will say no. Bring to the people who say yes, then you have to have that has to also be taken care of, right? But let's go through Rashi here now and off this part of the sugya. So kol kelim shebimikdash, right? Their length was the length of the house, except of the Aron, and the Aron was the length of the Aron width of the house. The kacha yamunach, and this is how it was placed. Rashi says kacha yamunach minalan. How do I know that it was placed like Mi dekachayu badav munachi mimizrach lemarav? Rashi here is anticipating a little bit the Gemara right afterwards. She wants to reset, like reading these lines is difficult. Kachaya munach seems to be completely superfluous. It just said, or kol arachbo shabayit. The kachaya munach, I don't need it to tell me kachaya munach. I know a munach, right? So that line is superfluous. The kachayu ya badav munachim bichlal lo muvan. What does it mean? So that was this whole sugya where the Gemara explains that. So Rashi's anticipating that. This is kachaya munach min nalan. How do I know that it's placed this way? That is, that its length went the width of the house. Because the badim, its badim went from east to west. As it says in this braita coming, right after this, so it implies that would tell us then that the length of the Aron went from north to south, and its width went from east to west. The badim, the putya da Aron kind, because the badim were the width of the Aron, as we say later on. like I said, Rashi here is just anticipating what the Gemara is going to say in a moment, so he doesn't keep us waiting. So then the Gemara said, "My." So how do I understand when the Gemara says "V'kachaya badav achin"? Hafikam v'kachaya munach mi de badav kam munachim. Because this is the way the Aron was played. Because that's how its staves works. That meaning, because its staves were from east to west, then obviously the Aron would have to go from north to south. Ubadav minara. So how do I know that the badim were placed that way? Rashi says, Ubadav minara to mizrach hamarav. How do I know that the badim went from east to west? The Tanya, vayerichu badim. You could say that maybe they lengthened the badim, but they didn't touch the parochet. So Rashi says, "B'parochet prusa b'petach beit kodshei hakadoshim l'tzniut ba'alma." So the parochet was spread in the opening into the kodesh hakadoshim on the Dvir, what Chazal called the Amatraksin. L'tzniuta ba'alma. It was put there just for covering up the space. V'lo mishum mechitza. It wasn't there to make a separation. The ha'amatraksin havai b'mikdash rishon, because the amatraksin was in Bayit Rishon. In other words, the purpose of the parochet in Bayit Shel Shlomo wasn't the same as the parochet in the Mishkan. The parochet in the Mishkan was also the mechitza. It was the complete separation between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. But in Bayit Shel Shlomo, I didn't need it for the separation because I have a wall. And as we learned, the wall had doors. It actually had two sets, right? So I didn't really need the parochet except the tzniuta ba'alma. Needed there as a covering. So maybe you'll say that I should say that what we're talking about here, what the Bright is talking about here, is the reality in Bayit Sheni, because in Bayit Sheni, as we know, there was a parochet. So he says you can't say that. To be mikdash sheni lo hava aron badim, right? Obviously, this can't be talking about Bayit Sheni, because in Bayit Sheni there was no aron and there were no badim, and the whole proof here is based on the idea that there was just a parochet, but that there was an aron with badim that was spoken of it. So this is obviously not a reference to Bayit Sheni. And how do I know there was no aron and badim? The Yoshiyahu Gnazo. Yoshiyahu put it into Geniza, the Masechet Yoma. If you want to do a funny reading, and it means that Yoshiyahu put it into Geniza in Masechet Yoma. But it means that we learn in Masechet Yoma that Yao put it into Geniza. Ba'od Tikra b'mikdash rishon k'tiv. Not only that, the proof text that we're bringing from Vayarichu Abadim, that's obviously talking about Mikdash Rishon. It's certainly not talking about Mikdash Sheni. Okay. So you might say, when it says that they lengthened the badim, that they didn't touch the parochet, but Talmud Lomar Vayareu, but the pasuk goes on to say, and they were seen, the badim were seen. So if they were seen, then Yachu Yuhum Karim Baparochet V'Yotzin, then maybe you'll say that they actually literally went through, that they tore through the parochet and they went out on the other side, and that's how you could literally see them. Talmud Lamar Lo Yera Lo Chutza, but the pasuk goes on to say, it says Vayarei Roshei and they were not seen on the outside. So how do you square it? So they were pushing out at the parochet. Rashi said, because the aron itself is in front of the opening of the dvir. Like it says in the Gemara Megillah, Aron she'asa Moshe kishemunach b'dvir hayalo eser amot revach anu lekota l'chol tzad. Right? Gemara in Megillah quotes the same source that we saw in Baba Batra, and says that the Aron of Moshe, when it was placed in the dvir, meaning in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, it had a width of 10 amot from it to the kotel, to all sides, to all four sides. But dvir haya esrim al esrim. The dvir was 20 by 20. Makonon eino mema'et b'dvir. The place of the Aron did not take away from the space of the dvir, the b'nei sayal made, because it stood by way of a miracle, as we learned. Alma, Alma, so teaches us be'emtza dvir kai. So it must have been, it was placed in the middle of the dvir. It was standing in the middle of the dvir. Ba'petach nami haya be'emtza b'kotel mizrachi. The opening was also in the middle of the eastern wall, the Amat Raksim. Vayu habatim boltim b'paroch petach, and then the team would be poking at the paroch that's in the middle of the Amat Raksim at the opening. So again, we pointed this out, like when we were in Melachim and Divrei Yamim. It does tell us that there's this opening in the dvir. It doesn't tell us exactly where it was, because it could have been on the north side, it could have been on the south side, it could have been in the middle. But the default assumption is that it was in the middle, which makes sense in context of other things, but it's not mefurash. But here we see that the Gemara is assuming, as Rashi is explaining, that the petach of the dvir was in the middle of the dvir, and it poked through kamin shnei dadeisha. Rashi says alma badini mizrach lemarav kaini. So Rashi brings us back to the whole question here. So it teaches us that then the badim must be from east to west. Roshan echad lemarav, Roshan echad lemizrach. Right, one head would have been on the east, and one would have been on the west. It should go the other way. One would have been on the west, and one would be on the east. Betoch hapetach, inside of the opening. Ushmamina rochbo she'aron, and the main thing is we learned that the width of the aron, shomina rochbo she'aron mimizrach lemarav. Shahaya or Choshel, the width of the Aron went from east to west. That would have been of the house, parallel to the length of the house. Let's just finish off Rashi here. So, how do we know that the Badim were on, in fact, the width of the Aron? They were on the length of the Aron. So Rabbi Yehuda says, "Tre gavre ba'amtu upalga lo mistagilu." Two men in the 7.5 amot, it's not enough for them. Rashi says, "Ihavu badim le'orcho." If they're on the length side of the Aron, bein bad lebad ela amam mechza. Right, as we said, there'd only be 1.5 amot between the two badim. And then the proof text comes from the Hakat, from the Kahatim. How do I know the proof text that there were 4 people? Comes from the pasuk Nasu Hakatim Nosei Hamikdash. Hakatim Shnaim Nosei Aron Hamikdash Shnaim. Rashi says, "V'kim halavim at mishkan kishahayu rotzim lachnot." So the Alevim would put up the Mishkan when they wanted to camp, to establish camp. They would put up the Mishkan before the people who were carrying the Aron would get there. So that by the time the people with the Aron, the Kahatim who were carrying the Aron get there, you can immediately go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. That was the order of the way things were done. Okay, so next time, the teaser for next time is the next part. Sugya Tanu Rabbanan Asara Shulchanot Asa Shlomo HaMelech. It's going to talk about the 10 Shulchanot. And then right after that, it's going to talk about the 10 Menorot. And then we'll go through a lot of these questions about where they were. The Gemara here doesn't directly address this question about what was the heter for Shlomo to make more menorot and more shulchanot and more kiyurim, because you might say it's sif. He's adding on something that the Torah itself doesn't tell you to do, so maybe he shouldn't have done it. So believe that I'll try to remember for next, show you the sources for that back in Shmot. There's like a remez to this idea already in Shmot. But I think that's it for tonight. Okay, so any last